Hello, everyone. So today, welcome you after a break. I would like to get it as quickly as I can with these videos, but it's not easy. But I hope you like this content. So today we'll talk about um, how critical thinking views a concept called sense making. Uh, it's maybe a new concept to you. Maybe you haven't heard about it. Um, it's not really a concept in philosophy. It's kind of concept in uh, organizational studies. That's where it originates from uh, uh, by business theorist Carl Weick in 1970s. Uh, then sort of when he intended to encourage a shift away from a focus on basically a very strict organizational theory on decision making that is quite hierarchical. That's how the basically management books were written back then, to something which is much more defocused and constitutes the actual meaning of the decisions that are enacted. So it's basically, in his terms, the process in which people create meaning from their collective experiences, and from the individual to collective, and then that what kind of behavior gets enacted at the end. So there's no really an agreed definition of sense making, um, but it's really about how people understand ambiguous and confusing issues or events. That's basically what it is, which is most of life. Remember, we talked in the beginning back then about the kind of complex world, and it was always complex, but now it's kind of more um, complex. The disagreements about the meaning of sense making is really about whether it's a mental process in a person or is a social process that occurs as a part of the discussion. So sense making up an individual process is something that is basically happens with our mental faculties and how we arrive to certain conclusions. But you can scale it up to an organization, and um, when it's scaled up to organization, then it's really useful for business. That's why the business uh, people like that, right? So I think the reason I touch on this is because I work in the organization and observe these kinds of behaviors, and how we actually create something out of very, very complex situations every day. I observe um, business leaders. I observe the people at work. I observe external stakeholders, and we manage stakeholders in various ventures, right? So I do observe, so I like to record my observations. And let's start with the individual, and let's talk about how the individual approaches um, uh, sense making from the information is given. Remember, we talked about the data pyramid, and we can revise that, not the data pyramid, sorry, the data information knowledge. Now, imagine that same pyramid. Now, but added to it is at the bottom, basically something which is, you get I can imagine that pyramid somewhere um, and very sitting on the sand. The sands are very um, unstable and shifting, and there's a lot of information. Well, it's not information; it's data pieces that come in from various directions, right? So when you sort that data, create information, there's a first level of uh, filtering, and that's that first level of filtering. It's basically our um, basic perceptions will be the first level of filtering. You can't really see the world as it is, right? It's impossible. It's impossible to see it with all its complexity. Basically, it's just like, some people say that the world itself is actually something that inside computer. What we see is just software or the screen representation, right? It's the monitor. It's the dials on the monitor, not the actual um, world as it is, right? That's a very interesting observation, but that comes straight from our um, consciousness. I mean, that's how, that's how we operate as humans. So we don't really see the world as it is. We can't see the world as it's impossible, right? Just forget it. Okay, so the perception is the first level. Now, at the perception level, there's a huge filter that simplifies the reality to what we could actually see. That everyone has that, right? So, okay, so we kind of got from the top base, that level, into the next step. And the next step is now we get some information. We need to form narratives from that information. So when you form narrative from that information, you employ another level of filters. It's the unconscious biases. We talked about them briefly, but they are ways for you to sort information in buckets that will create narrative that is suitable for you. So let's say you pursue a certain interest, and you want to think only the information that kind of comes that supports that, so that you employ confirmation bias. Very typical. Everybody does that. It's impossible to avoid. Okay, so that means the rejection of certain information that contradicts you. Now, when it reaches a certain limit that you cannot deny, of course, you will go through it. But you can afford a few kind of leaky pieces of information that are, not exactly, top notch in support of your theory, right? So that's how bias works. So you will actually kind of remove some of it. Now, the other level of filtering is your cultural predisposition. I mean, we're actually living in in cultures with a predisposed set of prejudices and biases that are maybe not evolutionary the way things like confirmation bias is. It just kind of typical for every human, but maybe some typical biases of places where we live. I mean, these are the ones that people are fighting against, etc. But let's say you get these kind of cultural predispositions, and you will try to sort something out there and then form narrative. So what happens is that, okay, you get the data. Now people say, hey, well, let's remove the biases, let's retrain people and just be diverse as we are, and just present the information the way it is. And that's all we want, right? So, well, okay, even AI wouldn't do that, because you would actually not be able to, somebody above you, somebody else, not above you, but maybe somebody who you want to transfer the information, transfer the knowledge to, needs to be able to understand it. So you need to create a narrative. We are creatures of metaphors, narratives, stories. We're not creatures of hard data analytics, right? We would like to be in business, of course, we would like to be, but it's not possible. Okay, we'll say we can. So at the level of when you transfer that information to somebody else, now that information now is owned by you. Remember, you already had some biases. You kind of coached it in the way you want to present it. You kind of pitched it, right? So that's how people say it sometimes. Pitch. It's not all. I mean, we all do this. So you created some coherent, cogent narrative story that is self-contained. You want to pass the ball. All right. So when you pass the ball, you pass it. You don't just pass it across, right? Because now we are dealing with a second membrane, which is perceptions, biases, and cultural predisposition of the person you are having a conversation with to transfer that. And so that is another difficulty. So the difficulty of communication. Now we're trying to align our cogent message that we think is cogent to somewhere else that is maybe not seeing that as much. So now the communication issue comes along, and we're not actually sure that what's actually being transmitted is the same as has been received. So there's a huge filter there, right? So now we're talking about, and that's just communicating person to person. Now we are actually cross the boundary of message, filtered message in our mind actually changing in somebody else's mind. Now multiply that, so we're talking about complex organization, multiply that many times. Multiply that many times, you have to make sure that this is actually understood the same way where everybody else impossible. All right, so what do you do in that situation? Now you're gonna make some able to make some decisions from that eventually, right? So you kind of have to transfer that information. At the same time as you do that, you also shape and react the environment you face. So you project yourself on the environment, and then you see the consequences of how you accurately see the world or not accurately see the world. So you correct and then transfer that up, right? So you do it, somebody else does it, but he also gets information from you. It's a very, very complex system, I can imagine. Now, everything in the organization is that complex. What you kind of that creates a very complex, almost a multiple dynamic cross purposes culture that is hard to control. Now states and strong organization control it through hierarchies, enforced messages. I mean, basically through, you could say, fear, or maybe not fear, but some sort of a level of um, respectful behavior that doesn't kind of make sure you completely dissolve. But it doesn't mean that people actually understand everything. I mean, they don't have to understand. They have to understand some bits of the message. But the point is, they get, so that's sort of what gets from the top, right? From the bottom, and maybe from the sides, you get conflicting messages, um, contradictory information, and eventually somebody. Now it could be one at the kind of lower level pyramid, maybe somebody at the top, president, CEO, has to make decision. There's whole science of decision making, right? So now the critical thinking is a tool of nerds, a tool of somebody who can spend some time clearly going through logical, induction thinking and coming up with, comparing hypotheses and coming up with the answer. Um, that is the prerogative or luxury of somebody who has that kind of time. And usually in the organizations, that dynamic, as I described, um, um, states or companies, that doesn't happen. There are too many, there's so much complex dynamic within the organization. Just transferring information and influencing of a person to a person. Now multiply that into a level of our human anthill. It is extremely complicated distribution of influences back and forth, and then kind of that kind of complex system. You could almost think like neurons firing in the brain, but eventually that gets to us making an act out of the world. Individual person acts out and makes a decision. But if you want to move to as an organization, they're set up in such a way that a decision maker at some level makes that decision, and that call, that's better be an informed decision. But what does it mean, be informed? Can't be informed of everything. Like we already told that the organization is surrounded by extreme complexity of and contradictory information. So the art here is to be able to make appropriate decision on incomplete, contradictory, and absent information sometimes, right? So how do you do that? As a gambling, is it what do people call gut feel? And sometimes you don't make no decision at all is also a decision. But these are kind of a complex topics. So critical thinking can be applied, in a certain environment when you have, a skill to actually have skill time to analyze things. When you don't, you will have to be able to see what you call see the wood from the trees and select things. So usually it comes with experience. So that's how I find that, of course, with experience comes a time when you'll be able to do it because you've done in a certain position many times. Sometimes it comes um, with sort of an insight that we talked about previously, um, that certain brilliant people have, and that's why people go after these the leaders, and how they make these kind of decisions, and so on, of course. But I think for many of the brilliant decision makers that did these kind of bold steps, there were a lot of them that did bold steps that failed and were wrong. And so there's a huge element of luck here. And I would postulate that the world is a little bit more random than we think, and a lot of these decisions are basically a sign of the premise that you have to make some decision. You can't be absolutely 100% informed, and that's why people take risks. Any organization takes risks. So the coming back to the sense making, it's a little different, but it's quite different than the old concepts of in a hierarchical organization, everybody behaves rationally, is a rational actor, wants to kind of utilitarianly uh, only good for himself, herself, and people surrounding, just sort of give or take mentality, um, and then also has rational tools at his disposal to do it. And the other people that person interacts with are also the same. Which of course it's not the case. People are not driven by self-interest. They are quite irrational, and in the interesting thing here is that when people are such creatures like that, yet the organizations today are still based on a rational um, kind of structure. I mean, it's a hierarchical structure that needs to make a decision after the elaboration. So there's a contradiction between a stated desire of organizations to be hierarchical, organized, and rational, and existing human tendency to being irrational, egocentric, self-interest, and which is normal because that's what humans do. And of course, they do all the other things. They also do empathy and so on. And then multiply that into organization all the way up and down, and you kind of create the complexity that will move you in a different position than, for example, if you originally started. So here, the main thing is just to be aware of not aware, but I mean just know this, right? And so I think it's the modern sort of business studies, and organizational psychology are very clearly in that area, that that what is stated will never be achieved, and therefore we kind of have to understand the world as it is, and the organizations as they truly are, as opposed as they what could be. And that's where the sense making is. So the other thing is quite important on that was the just context. People extract cues from context, and that's how they decide what information is relevant, what explanations are acceptable, and what are not. So the context, in an organization, what culture you are in, how you were born. Biases are one thing, but also how they culture organization work, how many people hold certain views, and what kind of people are in the team that have this view. So and obviously how the others have this view. So I think that Well, the other thing is probably the last one. That the people actually favor, and I notice a lot is in organizations that really um, want clarity. They favor plausibility over accuracy in accounts. So what people would look for is a coherent, cogent, and logically infallible theory. Not logical, not infallible, logically um, acceptable. I don't know the word, but say, logically well-sounding theory and explanation, as opposed to maybe an accurate but chaotic description of events, which is quite strange in a way, because in the current world, which is quite complicated and full of conflicting interest, facts that are not understood, and people with various identities or changing opinions. Just look at Twitter. A person can have a different opinion every day, for example. I would say, and that's what actually Wake said as well, 1970s, that accuracy is actually not uh, possible, right? So what you would do is just say, okay, I'll just kind of held to something which is plausible, and maybe that's right. Now it may be completely wrong as well, but that's what you think, the only thing you have. But in that plausibility, you'll also have to be very on the guard for anything similarly plausible potentially can come from the side, that you didn't expect, like the black swan or anything like that. So um, in summary, the sense making is kind of a complex theory in the organizational dynamic theory. There are some many books to read, but you could probably start with Wyke and his ilk. Yeah, so I think that's a good um, theory how organizations behave. But you apply it to human cognition. That's what I did. Instead of a simple description like we did before of data, information, knowing, decision, and it's the same pyramid, but now, as I've described to you, it's actually infused with so much complexity and so much of information that might lead you to make a different decision that you do is removed through these filters, and also through filters of communication. So I mean, it's another kind of art of communication is a huge part of it. But even with this art, I mean, you probably guaranteed that the person will not understand the message that you're transferring to that to the degree that you wanted. And because they also have their own biases, they also have their own egos, they have their reactants when you kind of try to write them. Um, uh, you know, they will react, and they are quite defensive. You are defensive, they are defensive. Everybody keeps their positions, and I think I'm amazed. Just to summarize, I'm amazed that humans can actually act out in the world and created this amazing civilization that we have, just purely from um, communicating with each other. I mean, it's truly amazing what has been achieved. Now, a lot of other things haven't been achieved, but I mean, this sort of um, has to be celebrated. So I gladly would continue talking about the sense making for quite some time, but I think we'll probably finish, and um, we'll talk to you later. Okay. Thank you, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.